I keep telling myself I don't think about that night anymore, and most of the time that's actually true, but every so often, usually when the apartment is quiet and I've had one too many glasses of wine, the memory comes back with a clarity that feels almost cruel, like my brain has been preserving it in perfect detail just to remind me how completely I failed to see what was right in front of me. My name is Jason, and I was 37 when all of this happened, though I want to be clear that it didn't happen in a single night. It was the culmination of years of small blindnesses, years of telling myself that the patterns I noticed in my family were just normal family things, years of giving people the benefit of the doubt because I loved them and because I genuinely believed that love was supposed to work that way. I had been with Madison for almost 6 years when I proposed, and I remember the moment I asked her with the kind of warmth that now feels embarrassing to describe. We were on a hiking trail we both loved, late afternoon, the light doing that thing it does in September where everything looks like a painting. And when she said yes, I felt like I had finally arrived somewhere I'd been trying to reach for a long time. We weren't kids. We were adults who had chosen each other carefully, or so I believed, and the engagement party my parents hosted a few months later felt like the natural celebration of something real and hard-won. My parents' backyard had been strung with warm lights. There was a guy with an acoustic guitar playing softly near the fence. The smell of the barbecue drifted through the whole yard, and I stood there at one point holding a drink and just looking around at the people who had come, friends, cousins, neighbors I'd known since childhood, and I thought, with a sincerity that now makes my stomach turn a little, that my life was almost exactly what I'd hoped it would be. I worked as a structural engineer on commercial construction projects. I was earning decent money. Madison and I had talked about buying a house after the wedding and standing in that backyard surrounded by people who seemed happy for us. I felt something close to certainty. That's the part one keep coming back to. Not the betrayal itself, but the certainty. How absolute it felt. How completely I had arranged my understanding of my own life around assumptions that were about to dissolve. Madison was glowing that evening, or at least that's the word everyone kept using, and she was moving through the crowd the way she always did at social events, effortlessly, stopping to take photos with my aunts, laughing at something my father said, squeezing my arm when she passed me. And I remember noticing how natural it all felt and thinking that this was what it was supposed to feel like, a life clicking into place. My brother Tyler was there too, of course. Tyler is 3 years older than me, and our dynamic had always been complicated in that specific way that only makes sense within a family, where the complications are so normalized that you stop being able to see them clearly. Tyler had always been the one who needed more from our parents, more patience, more intervention, more cleanup after the messes he made. And our parents had always provided it. And somewhere along the way, I had absorbed the unspoken message that being the steadier, more self-sufficient son was my role, my contribution to the family's equilibrium. I don't want to make Tyler sound like a villain in the backstory, because the truth is more boring than that. He was just someone who had always occupied more space than he'd earned, and our parents had always allowed it, and I had always adjusted. He was charming at the party, I'll give him that. He gave a toast that made people laugh. He hugged Madison warmly. He clapped me on the shoulder and said something about me finally making an honest man of myself, and I remember laughing along with everyone else and feeling genuinely glad he was there. That's the version of that night I held on to for years before I finally let myself reconstruct it more honestly. It was probably an hour or so into the party. The food had been eaten. The toasts had been made. People had spread out into smaller conversations, when I noticed that Madison had disappeared from my peripheral vision. I didn't panic immediately. She often needed a few minutes to herself at big social events, and I figured she'd gone inside to use the bathroom or get some air. I did a slow loop of the yard, checked the kitchen, glanced into the living room where a few older relatives were sitting, and it was only when I came back outside and started to register that I hadn't seen Tyler in a while either that something in my chest began to shift. One of my friends, a guy I'd known since college, mentioned almost casually that he'd seen them both heading toward the back of the property, past the garden. I thanked him and started walking in that direction, still telling myself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, still holding the certainty I mentioned earlier like something I could protect if I was just careful enough. The back of my parents' yard bordered a wooden fence with a row of old trees between the garden beds and the property line, and the lights didn't reach that far, and when I came around the side of the garage and let my eyes adjust to the dimness, I saw them. They were standing close together under one of the trees, and I want to be precise about this. It wasn't ambiguous. I have spent a lot of time over the years wondering if I interpreted something incorrectly, if I was unfair, If some other explanation existed for what I was looking at, and the honest answer is no. There was no other explanation. Madison had one hand resting against Tyler's chest, and his head was bent toward hers, and whatever was happening between them had nothing to do with being future sisters-in-law and brothers-in-law having a quiet conversation. I stood there long enough to understand what I was seeing, and then I stepped back into the shadow of the garage and just stood very still. I've tried to describe this moment to a few people over the years, and I always struggle to get it right. It wasn't like the movies, where the wronged person either explodes or collapses. It was quieter than that. It was like watching a building I'd been living in suddenly reveal a structural flaw so fundamental that I understood, in a single moment, that the whole thing had to come down. I didn't make a sound. I walked back through the party without making eye contact with anyone. And I remember the guitar was still playing, and people were still laughing, and the lights were still warm and golden, and all of it felt completely foreign, like I was walking through a set that no longer had anything to do with me. I found my car keys, got into my car, and drove to a motel on the edge of town that I'd passed 1,000 times and never expected to actually use. I sat in the parking lot for a while before I went inside, and I called my friend Dylan, because Dylan was the person I always called when I needed to think out loud. And when he picked up, I didn't know how to start, so I just said something like, "I need you to help me understand what just happened." And he drove over and sat with me in that motel room while I scrolled through the messages that had already started flooding my phone. I don't want to reproduce everything that was in those messages, partly because I don't remember all of it clearly and partly because some of it is still difficult to read, even in memory. But the outline was this. Tyler and Madison had been seeing each other for several months. Tyler seemed to genuinely believe that what they had was the kind of feeling that justified anything. Madison's message to me, the one that I think about most often when I'm being honest with myself, said that she hadn't planned for me to find out this way, as if the problem was the timing and not the thing itself. Dylan sat across from me and read everything when I handed him the phone, and then he set it down carefully on the table between us and said, "Jason, I'm so sorry." And that was the right thing to say, the only thing to say, and I appreciated that he didn't try to offer explanations or silver linings. I barely slept that night. I kept running through the years, looking for the moments I'd missed, the signs I'd explained away, the times Madison had been distant or Tyler had been strange around her, and I found things I hadn't let myself name at the time, and finding them didn't make me feel vindicated. It made me feel like a fool, which I know isn't a fair way to talk about myself, but it's the honest one. After a few days at the motel, I drove back to my parents' house to collect my things, some clothes I'd left there, documents, a few photos, and when I walked into the living room, I found my parents sitting with Tyler and Madison, not confronting them, sitting with them, calmly, like a family having a normal afternoon. My mother looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as pained but resigned, and my father said something about how sometimes feelings develop between people, and that doesn't have to mean the end of a family. And Tyler sat there looking at the floor, and Madison sat beside him like she had already made her peace with the new arrangement. And I understood in that moment with a completeness that surprised me that this was where we all actually stood. "I'm not asking you to choose sides," my mother said. And I almost laughed, because the choosing had already happened and the sides were already clear. I was just the last one to be informed. I didn't argue. I didn't demand anything. I went to my old room, packed what I needed, carried the bag through the living room without stopping. And when my father asked where I was going, I said I wasn't sure yet, which was true. I drove away, and somewhere on the highway I pulled over and blocked all 4 of their numbers. My parents, Tyler, Madison, not out of rage, but out of a very clear-eyed understanding that there was nothing left in those conversations for me. I thought, sitting there on the shoulder of the road with the engine idling and the ordinary world moving past me, that this was the end of something, and I was right. But I didn't yet know it was also the beginning of something else entirely. The first year after I left was the kind of year that doesn't make for an interesting story because nothing dramatic happens in it. It's just the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life from the foundation up. And I think that's actually the part people skip over when they tell stories like this. The part where nothing is resolved and nothing is healed, and you're just getting through the days, because getting through the days is the only option available to you. I had rented a small apartment on the other side of the city. Nothing remarkable about it. The kind of place with thin walls and a view of a parking structure. And I remember the first few weeks of living there with a strange fondness now, not because it was comfortable, but because the discomfort was entirely mine, untangled from anyone else's expectations or needs. And there was a weird freedom in that even when the freedom felt mostly like loneliness. I threw myself into work with an intensity that my colleagues probably found a little alarming, taking on bigger projects than I'd handled before, staying late, volunteering for the complicated assignments that other people were glad to pass off. And what I discovered was that I was actually good at it in a way I hadn't fully tested before. Because when you remove the mental bandwidth that's quietly being consumed by a relationship in trouble, even a relationship you don't know is in trouble. What's left is a surprising amount of capacity. Within 2 years, I had moved from managing individual project components to overseeing full construction timelines, coordinating with architects and city planners and contractors, and the work gave me something I genuinely needed at that point, which was evidence that I could build things that lasted. Dylan remained my closest friend through all of it, and I want to say something about Dylan here because he deserves it. He never pushed me to process the family situation on a timeline that wasn't mine, never suggested I should consider forgiving people before I was ready, never implied that cutting off contact with my parents and Tyler and Madison was anything other than a reasonable response to what had happened. He showed up with takeout on the nights I was clearly not okay. He asked about my projects with genuine interest, and he understood instinctively that what I needed most was not advice, but company, and he provided it consistently for years, and I don't think I've ever properly told him what that meant to me. Gradually, the sharp edge of the betrayal began to dull, not disappear, because I don't think that kind of thing disappears entirely, but dull, the way old injuries do when enough time passes and enough living accumulates around them. I dated a few people over those years, nothing that became serious, though not for lack of trying on my part. I think I was still working out, slowly and not always consciously, what I actually wanted from closeness and what I was and wasn't willing to risk. I moved into a better apartment, a modern place on a higher floor with actual natural light and a kitchen I liked cooking in, and I bought furniture that I chose myself for reasons that had nothing to do with compromise or shared taste. And I remember standing in the middle of the finished living room one evening and feeling something that took me a moment to identify because it had been absent for so long: contentment. Actual, uncomplicated contentment. By the time 4 years had passed since the engagement party, I rarely thought about any of them. My parents had attempted contact a handful of times in the first year. Cards, voicemails from numbers I hadn't blocked because I didn't recognize them, one note left with my building's front desk, and each time I had chosen not to respond, not out of ongoing anger, but out of a genuine assessment that there was nothing those conversations could give me that would be worth what they would cost. Tyler and Madison, I thought about even less. They had made their choices, I had made mine, and the distance between us had calcified into something that felt less like a wound and more like a simple fact of geography. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I was not sitting in my apartment nursing grievances and counting the years. I had built a life I was genuinely glad to be living, and the family I'd lost had become background, the kind of thing you mention in passing to explain why you spend holidays with friends instead of relatives, not the kind of thing that defines your present. And then one evening in the fall, I was sitting on my couch reading something, a quiet night, the city doing its ambient thing outside the window, and my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I nearly let it go to voicemail and forgot about it, which is what I usually did with unknown numbers, and I've thought about that almost decision many times since. But I picked up, and the voice on the other end was my mother's, Rachel, and she sounded nothing like I remembered her sounding. She sounded smaller. Somehow, the confidence that I had always associated with her voice compressed into something more careful and tentative. "Jason," she said, "I know I don't have the right to call you. I just need you to listen for a few minutes." I didn't hang up immediately, which I think surprised both of us. I sat there and listened, and what she told me came out in pieces, not in the organized way someone delivers prepared news, but in the fragmented way someone delivers news they're ashamed of. Tyler and Madison had married a couple of years after everything fell apart, which I had not known and absorbed now with less feeling than I would have predicted. They had started a home renovation company together, which honestly tracked with Tyler's personality. He'd always been drawn to projects that sounded impressive before the execution revealed the problems, and the business had struggled from early on and eventually failed in the way that businesses fail when the people running them make too many optimistic assumptions and not enough cautious plans. They had accumulated significant debt, and at some point, in a decision that my mother described with a kind of exhausted disbelief that told me she had argued against it, they had borrowed money from people who were not the kind of lenders you found through conventional channels. My parents had spent their savings trying to help, and the savings were gone, And now they were calling me because they had run out of other options and the situation had become serious enough that serious was the only word my mother kept reaching for. I listened to all of it. I let her finish. And then I sat with the information for a moment, feeling for the anger I expected to find, and finding instead something more like a tired recognition. The sensation of watching a pattern complete itself that you'd seen forming years earlier, but hadn't been able to stop. "Rachel," I said, because I couldn't make myself say mom in that moment without it feeling dishonest. "I hear everything you're telling me. I'm sorry you're in this situation, but I'm not going to be involved in fixing it." She started to say something about family, and about how she knew she had no right to ask, but hoped I could understand, and I let her get through it. And then I told her gently, but without any opening for negotiation, that the people who had created this problem were the ones who needed to solve it, that I had built my life without their help, and I expected the same courtesy in return, and that I wished them well and meant that sincerely, but that my answer was no. We said goodbye. I put the phone down and sat for a while in the quiet of my apartment, and I felt, not triumphant, not even particularly relieved, but steady, the way you feel when you've done something difficult that was nonetheless clearly right. I told Dylan about it the next day, and he said, "Good," with the simplicity of someone who had watched me rebuild from the ground up and wasn't interested in seeing the foundation disturbed, and I appreciated that more than I knew how to say. I thought that was the end of it. I thought the conversation with my mother was a door that had briefly opened and then closed again, and that life would return to its current shape, and I was wrong about that. Because less than half an hour after the call ended, my building's intercom buzzed, and later I understood that Rachel must have given them my address during that same conversation, perhaps hoping that if they showed up in person, I would find it harder to say no, or perhaps simply because she had run out of other ideas. And when the front desk patched through the camera feed to show me who was waiting in the lobby, I saw Tyler and Madison standing there, and whatever composure I had felt during the phone call began to reorganize itself into something considerably more alert. I want to say that I handled the next few minutes with complete calm, but that wouldn't be entirely honest. There was a moment, looking at that camera feed, and seeing Tyler and Madison standing in my lobby, with the particular body language of people who have already decided how this conversation is going to go, where something cold moved through me that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. The recognition that a situation you thought was resolved has in fact been waiting, that the distance you carefully built over 4 years can be crossed in an evening by people who have nothing left to lose. I told the front desk not to let them up. The concierge, a steady and unflappable man who had worked the building for years, acknowledged this without comment, and I watched on the feed as he delivered the message, and as Tyler's expression shifted from expectant to something harder, and Madison stood slightly behind him with her arms crossed, and they exchanged words with the concierge that I couldn't hear but could read clearly enough from the body language. They didn't leave. They stood there for several minutes. And then Tyler said something to the concierge that made the man pick up his phone, and my intercom buzzed again. And when I answered, the concierge said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had seen difficult situations before and was not going to be drawn into this one, "Sir, the visitors are asking me to tell you it's urgent and they won't be leaving." I told him to call the elevator for them. I don't entirely know why I made that decision. I've turned it over many times since, and the closest I can get to an explanation is that I wanted to be the one who chose the terms of whatever was about to happen. That letting them stand in the lobby indefinitely felt like a different kind of loss of control than letting them come up to a space that was entirely mine and where I had already, before they stepped off the elevator, pressed the silent alert on my building's security panel. I want to be clear about the timeline here because it matters. The security alert went out before they knocked on my door, not after. I had already made the decision to document whatever was coming before it arrived. When they knocked, I opened the door and looked at them both for the first time in 4 years, and I noticed things in the way you notice details when your nervous system is paying close attention. Tyler looked older in a way that had less to do with age than with accumulated strain, the easy confidence I remembered replaced by something tighter and more desperate. And Madison looked tired in a way that suggested the tiredness had been going on for a long time. "You need to let us in," Tyler said. Not hello, not an acknowledgement of the years or what had caused them. Just that, an instruction delivered by someone who had apparently decided that directness was his best remaining option. "You can say what you need to say from there," I told him, and he looked past me into the apartment with an expression that told me he had not come to talk. They pushed inside. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next because I'm aware that my account is the only one I have access to, and I've tried over the years to be honest with myself about the parts where my memory might be shaped by how I felt rather than purely by what occurred. But I can say with confidence that what followed was not a conversation. It was an attempt at coercion. Tyler talking fast, and with increasing agitation about the debt and the danger they were in. Madison occasionally interjecting with something that was pitched as an appeal to shared history, but felt more like leverage. And at some point, Tyler produced papers, actual physical documents, and said that I needed to sign something that would formalize a financial arrangement between us, and the word needed landed in the room with a weight that made the situation very clear. I stood very still. There's a thing that happens when you have spent years building a quiet life after a loud catastrophe. When you have done the work of understanding what you will and will not accept. When you have practiced, mostly in your own head, but practiced nonetheless, what you would do if something like this ever came to your door. There's a particular kind of calm that becomes available to you in that moment. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of clarity. And I felt it then, standing in my own living room with Tyler holding out papers I was never going to sign. "I need you both to know," I said, and I kept my voice level because there was no reason to raise it, "that this entire hallway, the elevator, the lobby, and this floor have been on camera since you arrived, and building security has already been notified." The shift in the room was immediate. Tyler lowered the papers slightly. Madison took a half step back. The agitation in Tyler's posture didn't disappear, but it reorganized itself into something more uncertain, and I watched him process what I'd said and watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the reassessment of a situation he had entered with one set of assumptions and was now understanding from a different angle. He started to say something about how I was being unreasonable, about how family didn't call security on family, and I let him get through a few sentences of it, and then I said, quietly, "Tyler, you forced your way into my home with documents you were expecting me to sign under pressure. I don't know what word you'd use for that, but I know what word I'd use." He stopped talking. The silence in the apartment lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement, and then the intercom buzzed, and the concierge informed me that security had arrived in the lobby and the police had been called as a precautionary measure given the nature of the alert, and I told him to send them up. And I watched Tyler and Madison exchange a look that contained what seemed like a compressed summary of everything that had gone wrong between them and everyone else over the past several years. Not guilt exactly, but the particular exhaustion of people who have made a long series of decisions that have led them here, to this specific door, to this specific outcome, and who can no longer pretend they didn't see it coming. The officers were professional and thorough. The concierge had footage from every camera in the building showing the entry, the altercation at the front desk, and the moment Tyler and Madison pushed past my threshold uninvited. Tyler attempted an explanation that became increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of the footage. Madison said very little. I provided my account once, calmly, without editorial, and I remember one of the officers looking at me with an expression that I interpreted as mild surprise. I think they had expected more of an emotional wreck and found instead someone who was, by that point, simply very tired and very clear. Tyler and Madison were removed from the building, and I stood at my window for a while after everyone had gone and looked out at the city doing its ordinary nighttime things, and I felt, not satisfaction, because nothing about any of it was satisfying, but something closer to the conclusion of a very long sentence, the arrival at a period after years of unresolved syntax. A few days later, my parents came to the building, not unannounced this time. My mother called first and asked if they could come, and something in her voice was different enough from the previous call that I said yes. They sat in my living room, Gregory and Rachel, looking around at the space I'd built without them, and my mother said that she was sorry, and my father said that the way they had handled things after the engagement had been wrong, and that they had known it was wrong and had told themselves a story about keeping the family together that had required them to be dishonest about what keeping the family together actually cost. I listened to all of it. I believed that they meant it. I also understood, sitting across from them in my apartment, that meaning something and that thing being sufficient are not the same, that an apology, however genuine, cannot reconstruct what was lost, cannot give back the years or the certainty or the version of my family I had believed in. "I'm glad you came," I told them, and I meant that too. "But I need you to understand that things can't go back to what they were, and I'm not sure I'd want them to even if they could." My mother nodded slowly, and my father looked at the floor, and we sat together for a while longer talking about smaller, safer things, and when they left I stood in the doorway and watched the elevator doors close and felt something complicated that I didn't try to immediately resolve. In the weeks and months that followed, I learned, through my parents and through the residue of information that surfaces even when you're not looking for it, that Tyler and Madison had declared bankruptcy, that the situation with the lenders had been resolved through legal channels in a way that hadn't required anyone to get hurt, but had required the surrender of basically everything they'd accumulated, and that they were living with my parents while they tried to figure out what came next. I don't know what Tyler feels about any of it. I don't know what Madison thinks when she considers the trajectory from that backyard engagement party to her current situation. I've tried, in my better moments, to extend something like compassion toward both of them, not because they deserve it from me specifically, but because carrying anything heavier than compassion for people who have moved to the margins of your life is a weight that only hurts the person carrying it. My relationship with my parents exists now in a form I didn't anticipate, but have come to understand. Occasional calls, a visit at the end of the year, conversations that stay on the surface not out of hostility, but out of a mutual acknowledgement that the deeper waters are still complicated and that we are all, in our different ways, navigating them carefully. Dylan came over the week after everything with Tyler and Madison, and we sat at my kitchen table, and I cooked something, and we talked about it for a while, and then we talked about other things. His work, a trip he was planning, a series we'd both been watching. And at some point I realized that the Tyler and Madison conversation had taken up maybe 20 minutes of an evening that was otherwise just an ordinary good night between two people who had known each other long enough to be comfortable in the silences, and that felt like the right proportion, like something had finally found its correct size. I think about that engagement party sometimes, the lights, the guitar, the smell of the food, the way everything looked from the outside like exactly what it was supposed to be, and I no longer feel the vertigo I used to feel when the memory surfaced. It happened. It changed everything. And I built something on the other side of it that is genuinely mine. And that is enough, more than enough. And on most nights when I'm sitting in this apartment that I chose and filled with things I chose and a life I assembled from my own decisions, I feel something that I am no longer surprised to recognize as peace. If you've read this far, I'm curious. Have you ever been in a situation where the people who were supposed to protect you chose someone else? And if so, how did you find your way back to yourself? I'd genuinely like to know.
I'm struck by how Jason managed to simply cut off his toxic past and rebuild a life entirely on his own terms. It seems the hardest part was realizing that those closest to him could actually be total strangers. My advice to Jason would be to keep that distance. He owes nothing to people who already betrayed him once. What are your thoughts on Jason's story, and what would you advise him to do? Let us know in the comments.